is created and widely distributed. For too long, the U.S. has denied and minimized this problem. That time should end. Thank you, and I look forward to our discussion today.
Professor Simi, thank you very much for your testimony. And now we will go to Mr. Gonzalez for your 5 minutes.
Thank you, Ranking Member Raskin, Chairman Raskin, Ranking Member Sessions, and Chairwoman Maloney for allowing me to speak. My name is Mike Gonzalez. I'm a senior fellow at the Heritage Foundation. The views I express in this testimony are my own, should not be construed as representing any official position of the Heritage Foundation. I was a foreign correspondent for 15 years, living and covering some of the globe's most dangerous spots. I have been tear gassed in Korea, arrested and expelled from Panama, and traveled with the Mujahideen in Afghanistan in the 1980s. I have also lived in Cuba, where I was born. I have, in other words, known political strife in my life, up close. I do not recommend it. One of the many good things about our country is that we generally resolve our political differences in peace. The periods of political violence we have had have been exceptions in 240 years of political peace and prosperity, an experiment in self-rule and limited government that was hitherto unknown to man. Unfortunately, for the past 12 months, America has lived through moments of violence on its streets, a period of instability led by the Black Lives Matter organization. The violence has so far led to at least 25 Americans being killed, and according to the Insurance Information Institute, more than $1 billion in insured losses. We have witnessed over 600 riots, according to the U.S. Crisis Monitor, and BLM activists were involved in 95% of the incidents coded as riots for which the identity of the participants is known. Federal buildings came under attack, police stations were torched, etc. The period of political instability we're currently experiencing was sparked by the horrifying killing of George Floyd on May 25th last year. The violence associated with BLM, however, was not restricted to just last year. In a paper published just this month, University of Massachusetts researcher Travis Campbell tracked more than 1,600 BLM protests nationwide between 2014 and 2019. Campbell found that, quote, civilian homicides increased by 10% following protests, unquote. Vox, by no means a conservative outlet, put the impact this way. That means that from 2014 to 2019, there were somewhere between 1,000 and 6,000 more homicides that would have been expected if places with protests were on the same trend as places that did not have protests. Obviously, both BLM and Antifa are not the only sources of political violence in America. Americans of different races and both sexes broke the law and entered the U.S. Capitol on January 6th. That act was, needless to say, despicable. The members of this great body sought refuge, and many feared they could be harmed or worse. It is important to condemn this act. The people who have participated in violence and property destruction on the U.S. Capitol on January 6th deserve prosecution. And unlike the vast majority of those who participated in BLM riots over the past summer, they are being prosecuted. The message needs to be sent across the land that no political violence will be tolerated. January 6th took place in the context of far too many Americans apparently coming to the conclusion that their grievances will only receive a hearing and that political leaders will bend to their demands if they take to the streets, invade and attack public and private buildings, and intimidate their fellow Americans. You, our political leaders, have the responsibility to stop this dangerous notion from spreading. And if you do nothing, the responsibility for continued violence will be yours as well. Instead, a member of the House said at a demonstration last month, before the Derek Chauvin verdict was rendered, quote, we got to stay on the street and we got to get more active. We have to get more confrontational. We got to make sure that they know we mean business, unquote. If people on the right or left, Republican or Democrat, continue to justify and excuse the political violence of those whom they believe to be, quote unquote, on my side, they're simply condoning these acts and encouraging more rather than suppressing them. In closing, I would like to quote from my upcoming book on Black Lives Matter, in which I make the point that the groups that are reported to have been involved in the disgraceful January 6th attack have, quote, very little power over our lives. For all their awful symbolism of the attack, these groups do not have political action committees, bills in Congress, millions of dollars in hands, a curriculum being disseminated to the country's 14,000 school districts, a sycophantic media that acts as its press agent, or the cultural cachet that lets BLM partner with the musical Hamilton. BLM has all these things. I want to thank you very much for your time and attention and for the honor of testifying with you today.
Mr. Gonzalez, thank you so much for your testimony. I feel like I've been doing a lot of talking, so I'm going to hold my questions until we get to the end. And perhaps Debbie Wasserman Schultz, if you're ready, you can be the first majority questioner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm ready to go, and I appreciate your indulgence, although not necessary. And I will say that I was hopeful that this hearing would start out without divisive rhetoric. Unfortunately, that was not to be the case. I certainly think that tossing around loaded language like the ranking member did by referring to so-called instigators and accusing organizations like Black Lives Matter groups, who are certainly doing nothing except making sure that they could stand up for justice, is inappropriate for a hearing like this. That having been said, I want to ask my questions first of Professor Simi. You're an expert in white supremacist groups. Many leaders of the militia movement publicly disavow racism and distance themselves from white supremacist ideologies. And they claim that their movement is motivated not by racial animus, but by concerns about a tyrannical U.S. government and a sinister New World Order. I mean, I think these claims of anti-racism are a smokescreen that makes it more difficult to effectively combat militia extremism. Do you consider, this is for Professor Simi, do you consider racism and white supremacy to be an animating factor of militia extremism?
Well, in short, yes. And I would agree that it is a strategy that's widely practiced. This disavow it's a public relations, it's a branding campaign, it's a way to create confusion, and it's a well-worn strategy. It existed for a long time. I mean, even people like David Duke, a Klan figure, a well-known neo-Nazi, used this strategy in part to get elected to the state legislature to Louisiana. So this is a well-worn strategy that's existed for a long time, and certainly militia groups of various kinds utilize this strategy. And so you have to look at kind of behind the scenes and dig a little deeper to really see what are very clear indications of racial animus and various other related forms of bigotry.
Another linkage between militia extremism and the broader problem of white supremacist violence is a vast fascination with conspiracy theories. In recent months, even in this committee hearing today, we've seen militia groups attend various protests and events to, quote, confront Antifa, a group whose members they believe are trained in Syrian terror camps and funded by George Soros. So, Professor, we've seen tragic examples like the shooting at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh of how conspiracy theories can motivate people to commit acts of violence. As new conspiracy theories gain prominence within the militia movement, what threat do these beliefs pose to our collective safety?
Well, the conspiracy theories are very central to extremists of all sorts. They really provide a type of glue in many respects, and they will often provide points of continuity and connection to folks that might not otherwise be connected. So, in many respects, what we're dealing with is a worldview, a broad worldview, a constellation, and the conspiracy theories oftentimes are the things that are connecting the dots, right? And so the conspiracy theories can start off in ways that might appear somewhat benign, but they can take hold and really move in a much more radicalized, violent direction. And so that's obviously our gravest concern in terms of threat to public safety.
And really, in my last seconds, I want to ask Ms. McCord, how does militia coordination with other far-right extremists during the insurrection demonstrate the risks of viewing militia groups as separate from other white supremacist extremists? Because we certainly had warnings and demonstrable evidence that there was coordination between white supremacists and militia groups, and you could see that in the video from 60 Minutes that the chairman showed as well.
Yes, thank you for your question. So my organization worked with a lot of researchers over the past years that were tracking the online social media and other activity of militia extremist groups, as well as conspiracy theorists, accelerationists, and other white supremacist extremist groups. And we saw an incredible cross-population of their propaganda and rhetoric. So it's not as though militias only talk to militias, et cetera. And I think that was really illustrated in the actual insurrection, because you had all of these groups stepping out of that virtual space into that physical space in Washington, D.C., united around a narrative that had been building even before the election, went into overdrive after the election, the Stop the Steal narrative, and it was able to be that coalescing force that brought all these extremist groups together. The militias, of course, had pre-planned, as you saw in the 60 Minutes piece, and as many of us knew from looking at social media and their communications, not communications that were encrypted or using surveillance techniques, but just within their own forums. And we knew that they were planning in advance and planning things like a quick reaction force. Put that together with the crowds, the conspiracy theorists and the crowds. You had the crowd became a mob. They led the charge, and the insurrection ensued, participated in by many, many, many people.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for allowing me the opportunity to connect the dots with my line of questioning today, and I yield back.
You're very welcome. The gentlelady's time has expired. I turn now to the ranking member for his 5 minutes of questioning. Mr. Sessions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. McCord, do you consider the KKK to be a group that would advocate violence or use of force?
The KKK has in the past, and in fact, in your home state, Congressman, there was a case in the 1980s brought against the militia wing of the KKK, a successful case that resulted in enjoining them from their abusive threats and violence against Vietnamese fishermen who had relocated there after the war.
Okay, let us try and go at least to 2015 and forward then. Do you believe that the KKK uses violence or use of force?
I think there are members that do. I would say that is not currently one of the militia groups that I think are presenting the greatest threat. Militia groups include nationwide groups, like we've heard about, Oath Keepers, Three Percenters. They also are at the local level, and many people associate with both. The KKK is a white supremacist group that has members that advocate, that are part of militias and that advocate for violence, and has others that have, their own points of view and maybe don't advocate for violence.
Thank you very much. Do you believe that that there's any group within the United States military that would take this action on of violence or use of force within the military? Not that military members might or might not be part of that, but within the actual military.
I'm not entirely sure I understand the question. I mean, certainly some militias recruit from the military. We knew that there is at least one active duty military has been charged resulting from the insurrection. I don't think if what you're asking is, do I think there's a group within the military that in their role as active duty military would attempt to commit acts of violence in the U.S.? I don't know of any research that has shown that to be a current threat. But the military is barred by many reasons, Posse Comitatus Act among them, from engaging in domestic law enforcement. So generally speaking, the military does not even engage in activity in the U.S. absent certain exceptions under the Constitution and federal statute.
Yes, ma'am. That was my question. Dr. Simi, do you, going to the questions of violence and use of force, do you believe that BLM would fit within that category?
No, I do not.
Do you believe that Antifa would be included in use of violence or use of force?
There would be some aspects of Antifa that would fit that.
There would be some. Do you believe that the 3 percenters have found themselves in circumstances that we could point to where they had violence and use of force?
Sure. In Kansas, they were plotting to, there was 3 percenters that were arrested and charged with trying to attack a housing a community where immigrants lived. So, yeah, absolutely.
And what year was that, sir?
Approximately 2 years ago.
2 years ago. Do you consider that the people who were engaged in showing up at military funerals to disrupt people, I don't remember their name, do you consider that they would be considered violent and use of force also that we need to pay attention to?
I think you're referring to the Westboro Baptist Church.
I would be.
Okay. As far as my knowledge, I have no information of any history of them being actually involved in violence. In fact, they were involved in a successful Supreme Court case, as I recall.
Well, use of force would be, and I think that I would be, I would say that I believe that their use of force showing up at funerals to disrupt them is a use of force. Thank you very much. Mr. Gonzalez, do you consider that BLM uses use of violence and use of force to achieve their political beliefs?
Thank you, Congressman. Yes, as I said, I was quoting the Armed Conflict Location and Events Data Project, which is not a conservative outfit. Their crisis monitor was very clear that we had 633 riots last year, and that out of events coded as riots, and that in 95% of those for which the identity of the perpetrator was known, they were BLM activists. So it's very hard to say that BLM does not provoke violence when you have the ACLED showing this data.
Thank you. And the Attorney General, if I could ask you one last question, do you care who it is that shows up in the state to cause violence or use of force? Are you concerned about just those two things, and you would take action against any of them? Any of the groups? I mean, three percenters, KKK, Antifa, BLM, anyone that showed up in New Jersey to use violence or use of force, do you believe that you would, as Attorney General, view them all as a threat to the public safety?
The gentleman's time has expired. Answer the question.
I would.
Thank you.
I would, Ranking Member.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for the time.
You bet. Thank you, Mr. Sessions. Going now to the distinguished Congresswoman from Illinois, Ms. Kelly.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for holding this hearing. I must admit, starting off with 60 Minutes, that was hard to look at as one of the people that was in the gallery hoping to get out alive. That brought it back. I want to thank the Attorney General for what you said. I've been fighting in Congress for over 8 years and discussing gun violence prevention, trafficking, straw purchases, and all of that. But it's been very difficult to get colleagues on the other side of the aisle to agree to work on any of those issues. So I'm glad you raised how important it is. And also the other thing is, it is a little, or I won't even say a little, it is a lot insulting to hear about BLM when BLM protesters, and it's okay to protest in the United States, came to the Capitol. There were lots of, armed people out, all covering the steps, making sure they didn't do anything. And that same, it was very different when it was, it may have been mixed, Mr. Gonzalez, but it was at least 95 to 98% white that stormed the Capitol, and with very little resistance because they were not prepared. So it's a little insulting to hear, I don't care if someone's Black, I don't care if but it's always a person of color that was mentioned that, we don't care about. And it's just so frustrating. It's hard for me to even get my words out that, the way people talk, you don't even understand your privilege. You don't even think about, why there is a Black Lives Matter, why it's necessary for there to be a Black Lives Matter. Because just listening to the conversation, we don't count, and we do count. In August of 2020, 17-year-old Kyle Rittenhouse from Illinois traveled across state lines to join the Kenosha Guard militia, which has sent out a call for help policing Black Lives Matter protests that were occurring in the city of Kenosha, Wisconsin. As we all know, Rittenhouse arrived armed with a rifle to, in his telling, protect private property. After several cordial interactions with Kenosha police, Rittenhouse fatally shot 2 protesters and wounded another. He is now awaiting trial for first-degree murder. This incident reveals that though militias are generally thought of as anti-government, they pose a very real threat to the general public. Yet the federal government continues to stress the threat that militias pose only to government officials. As the ODNI asserted in its March report, Ms. McCord, you have been involved in several lawsuits filed in the wake of violent militia activity. Can you give some background on the lawsuits and what kind of laws you have utilized to make your claim? And then just go on to talk about what is your view of the threat militia pose to civilian populations as opposed to just government officials?
Yes, thank you for the question. I spent a long career, by the way, at the Department of Justice, 23 years there, and left in May of 2017. In August, of course, we saw the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, and we saw self-professed militias coming there from across the country, ostensibly to protect the rights of the white nationalists, neo-Nazis, and neo-Confederates. We also saw those white nationalists and neo-Nazis themselves engaging in paramilitary activity, coordinated armed activity against counter-protesters. So my organization at Georgetown, recognizing that wasn't protected First Amendment activity, that violence, those threats of violence, it wasn't protected under the Second Amendment, given the Supreme Court's case law about paramilitary activity, we relied on state anti-paramilitary laws, the laws I spoke about in my testimony, the state constitutional provision in Virginia, state anti-paramilitary law, state law prohibiting private individuals from adopting the functions of law enforcement, and also public nuisance. And we brought a lawsuit strictly for injunctive relief, not for damages, forward-looking injunctive relief on behalf of the city, small businesses, and residential associations against 23 different individuals and organizations who had participated in that unlawful militia activity. We were successful against motions to dismiss, challenging our legal theories, and after we were successful in defeating those motions, all of the organizations, except for a couple who had defaulted, and all of the individuals, including the organizers, entered into consent decrees, which the court then issued as court orders, permanently prohibiting them from returning to Charlottesville as part of a unit of 2 or more persons acting in concert while armed with a firearm or anything whose purpose is for use as a weapon during any demonstration, protest, rally, or march. We've used the precedent there to advise jurisdictions, small and large, and including advising law enforcement about these tools that they have under their state law to issue reasonable, content-neutral time, place, and manner restrictions in order to protect public safety during demonstrations without infringing on First Amendment rights and Second Amendment rights. And we've recently, this past summer, co-counsel with the Bernalillo County, New Mexico District Attorney, Raul Torres, who is, we are co-counsel with him in an enforcement action against a local militia in New Mexico that deployed to a racial justice demonstration, heavily armed, again, ostensibly to protect, to prevent demonstrators from tearing down a statue of a Spanish conquistador, and that case is ongoing. So what we have seen— I
know my time is up, so I don't want to— I'm sorry.
I'm sorry.
You can finish your point, Ms. McCord, and thank you, Ms. Kelly.
Yeah. So what we've seen in these cases and engaging again, and I've spoken with officials, Republicans and Democrats across the country who are looking for help to protect public safety. We've seen militias repeatedly traveling. We see they continue to muster and train. They talk about opposing governmental tyranny. There's no support in our history or constitution for that role by private actors. And we've seen them infringing on other people's constitutional rights, other people's rights to free speech and to petition their government. So I see them very much as a public safety and national security threat.
Thank you very much. I will now come to Mr. Biggs for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank the ranking member, and I appreciate the witnesses being here today. Mr. Chairman, as I begin today, I'd like to request that this committee investigate the connection between the Wuhan Institute of Virology and the COVID-19 pandemic. Some of us have been speaking about that connection between the lab and the spread of the virus for some time, but there's recently been increased discussion about the origins of the pandemic. And even Dr. Fauci seems to be coming around to the position that the virus may have originated at the lab. I know it's not on topic, but the pandemic has impacted every aspect of American life for over a year, and it's time for a thorough investigation into the origins of the virus. This should be an area, in my opinion, that garners bipartisan support. We should all want to know how the pandemic started. And so I will be submitting several articles on that, for the record, on that topic. Now, this is the fifth hearing that this subcommittee has held on confronting white supremacy. Over the summer, we saw riots engulf our cities. Small businesses were destroyed, shops looted, churches set on fire, and yet we've not had a single hearing on Antifa and its violent activities. And so I get we're looking at Oath Keepers. That was what your focus was when you brought up the 60 Minutes video. This is what NPR says about 60 Minutes from a piece just a month ago. Quote, still it's, speaking of the Oath Keepers, quote, still it's not a rigid, cohesive organization. Instead, researchers say it's loosely knit. The Justice Department describes it as a large but loosely organized collection of individuals. And what does CBS say about Antifa? It's very similar to that. It's not a highly organized movement, nor is it merely an idea. It's a loose affiliation of local activists scattered across the U.S. and a few other countries. It seems to me, Mr. Chairman, that we ought to be looking at both of these groups. If you're going to spend time looking at Oath Keepers, let's look at Antifa too and see what they've done, because we've had unrest around this country for over a year now. But given the events of the past couple of weeks, I would also ask that the subcommittee hold hearings on the anti-Semitic violence that's occurring in cities across the country. For example, last week, a synagogue in Tucson, Arizona, was vandalized. In New York City, a Jewish man was beaten in the middle of the street. In Bal Harbor, Florida, foreman yelled, "Die Jew," at a man in a skull cap. Then they threatened to rape his wife and his daughter. On Thursday, the Anti-Defamation League shared early reports of 193 anti-Semitic incidents in the U.S. compared with 131 during the previous week. On Twitter, the group said it found more than 17,000 tweets using variations of the phrase, "Hitler was right," between May 7th and 14th. Now, regardless of where those anti-Semitic sentiments and violence originate, I think we need to be looking at those as well. There was a TikTok challenge against Palestinian youth to violently beat up an Orthodox Jew and post a video of the assault on the platform. Mr. Gonzalez, I turn to you now. Can you explain why it is important for Congress to focus on all types of political violence and not just one?
Thank you, Congressman. Obviously, in a democracy, the voter has to hear from both sides, and the voter cannot be intimidated, but it cannot be fear to be canceled or afraid to speak. If we continue on the path we've been on, in which one side justifies the violence of those it deems to be on their side, then we're just condoning them, and we're going to get more violence. In my experience, we get more of what we condone and less of what we discourage. So I think it is proper and necessary to discourage and condemn the violence that took place on January 6th and the violence that took place during 2020. Both sides need to be condemned, especially by our leaders. Thank you for your question.
So you also said in your statement that, quote, our media and pundits have taken a side in our political debates, itself a dangerous development. Do not speak of the BLM violence in the same context of political violence as on January 6th, close quote. Will you please expand on that and tell us why you think it's important that we treat all acts of, that we not treat acts of political violence differently?
Yeah, sure. The media, in my opinion, my humble opinion, all through 2020, did not really report or cover what was happening, the BLM-led violence. It rather covered for them. Again, this is not informing the public, which is the role of the media. The media should be impartial, should be objective, should report as it did on January 6th, but it should also report on what happened in Kenosha, what happened in Portland, what happened in Seattle, what happened in many, many, many cities during 2020. Let's not forget what we lived through in 2020. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
All right. Thank you for your questioning, Mr. Biggs. Coming now to the gentlelady from Massachusetts, Ms. Presley.
Thank you, Chairman Raskin. Echoing the sentiments expressed by my sister colleague there from Illinois, I would just like to say how deeply offensive it is and inaccurate to equate the Black Lives Matter movement with militia groups. Just know that when you do that, as many of my colleagues are prone to quote Dr. King, that you are in fact spitting on Dr. King, on his name, on his legacy, an original architect of the Black Lives Matter movement. He was protesting police brutality, poverty, racism, and militarism. But I digress, and doing it non-violently, and was affirming that Black Lives Mattered and was murdered because of it. But I digress. The oppression, the struggle continues, and white supremacy continues to thrive, and these militia groups are a threat to our democracy, to every American, especially minoritized and marginalized groups who call this country home. And it is especially alarming that these violent extremists are operating with the tacit and explicit support of police officers who have taken an oath to keep us safe. Militia groups like the Oath Keepers, who we saw in that video openly bragging about having active duty law enforcement in their membership. And leaked data suggests that 2/3 of their members have law enforcement or military affiliations. The 3%ers, as have been mentioned, another white supremacist militia who actively recruit from law enforcement and military communities, including members who were arrested for their role in the January 6th attack. And we cannot ignore that the violent, racist, anti-Semitic, white supremacist mob that endangered the lives of myself, my colleagues, staff, and included current and former police officers. Professor Semi, you study this link between policing and extremism. Are you surprised by the prevalence of Oath Keepers and the 3%ers with law enforcement and military affiliation?
Thank you for the question. No, I'm not surprised. Again, this is these specific groups represent a broader problem, which is the infiltration of right-wing extremism into law enforcement ranks, which has been, a problem that we've been dealing with for a long time, but again, not necessarily addressing in nearly as an aggressive manner as we should have been. And so it doesn't surprise me. It concerns me greatly. And I really think it speaks to the need for a national initiative to try and root out, first of all, try and identify, because we really don't know the extent of the actual problem in terms of the number of right-wing extremists that are actively hold positions in law enforcement. And it's not just those that are members of groups either. It's folks who are adherents on some level that have the beliefs, that have certain animus that is undeniably going to influence how they conduct themselves on the job. And so we know that having these kind of strong beliefs affect a person's behavior on the job. So it's both the membership, but it's also folks that have the beliefs that aren't necessarily connected to any specific groups. And so I think we need to have a national tracking initiative to try and identify this and then root it out. Thank you.
Thank you. And how would you say that the presence of law enforcement, military personnel, could you unpack that a little bit more? How does that make militia groups more dangerous? What is the impact?
Well, yeah, one, it's, the authority that you have as a law enforcement officer. And in terms of military, of course, you're receiving highly skilled training. And so one of the things that a lot of these types of groups really are looking for are folks with certain kinds of skill sets in terms of, experiences with weapon training, explosives, and just frankly, leadership training as well. And so these groups, oftentimes, one of the reasons why they go after, in terms of recruitment of veterans, is that they're looking for those kind of skill sets. And then on the front end is that in many cases, groups will encourage their members to join the military. So that is individuals who are already of this mindset, go into the military for very strategic purposes in order to, again, acquire that kind of training. So I would say the training is the big kind of threat there in terms of, threat to public safety.
Thank you. And again, we've repeatedly seen how covert and overt law enforcement allegiance to militia activity has emboldened white supremacist extremists and has contributed to vigilante activity. In Salem, Oregon, officers advised militiamen to stay out of sight leading up to the curfew to avoid arrest. In Philadelphia, an officer stood by as white supremacist vigilantes assaulted a reporter. In Albuquerque, police allegedly referred to a local militia as armed friendlies. And in Kenosha, Wisconsin, the police praised militia members shortly before one of them, Kyle Rittenhouse, shot and killed 2 protesters. The direct partnership between law enforcement and white supremacist militias must be called out and must be confronted. Attorney General Graywall, how has your office been able to successfully prevent infiltration of state law enforcement by Oath Keepers, 3%ers, and others?
The gentlelady's time has expired, but Attorney General, please answer the question.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, Congressman Presley. I'm the Chief Law Enforcement Officer for my state, and I have oversight authority over 38,000 law enforcement officers and 530 law enforcement agencies. And I have the ability in my state, which is unique for AGs, to issue law enforcement directives, which are binding on all law enforcement officers. So we've been working with our Division on Civil Rights, with our Office of Homeland Security and Preparedness, to do a survey of white supremacist groups that are active here, to include Oath Keepers, to include 3%ers, to compile their insignia and the signatures that they use to better inform our chiefs of police so they could formulate policies, whether uniform policies not to allow folks to wear patches, which we've seen in the past of 3%er patches on uniforms and things of that nature, because we think that has no place in law enforcement and people with these ideologies have no place in law enforcement. And we're also working on the front end to screen out those individuals from coming into law enforcement. So we're doing more as far as background checks, social media scrubs to make sure that these types of individuals don't come into law enforcement, because I can think of nothing that undermines the trust of the public more quickly, which we're trying to build every day, than allowing these types of individuals who hold these ideologies to enter into law enforcement.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Presley. Come now to Mr. Franklin for his 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses today. I really appreciate the effort you put into your testimony. I found it all to be very informative. Attorney General Grewal, and looking at your comments, your testimony, I see that you made an assessment that New Jersey classifies white supremacist extremists and homegrown violent extremists as the most persistent hostile actors in the state. And that was after the background you gave in your testimony. You started with Timothy McVeigh, which I think for myself as an adult, that was my first clear memory of domestic terrorism, though, I mean, obviously back in the 60s, we had the Weather Underground and other groups like that, but that was a very significant event. Timothy McVeigh was clearly, at least from what we learned of him, a white supremacist. He was also anti-government. You also referenced the attack in New Jersey in 2019 that killed 6. That was actually perpetrated by an African-American anti-Semite. You referenced the gentleman, well, not gentleman, but Mr. Brahimi from New Jersey, who was arrested January 6th. He's currently awaiting trial on a number of charges. And then also the Parkland shooting in Florida that was attributed to a person with severe mental illness that should have never happened. And that was known, and had the system worked, that tragedy could have been avoided. But I was kind of puzzled from your testimony to how you drew that white supremacy is the overarching threat to the state of New Jersey. And then I thought, well, maybe you'd made reference to a source that was cited also in this memorandum about the hearing we have today that was done by Department of Homeland Security's a Homeland Threat Assessment. And in that assessment, so I went looking for that, thinking, well, surely there must be a lot of meat on that document there that I'd like to learn about. What we received was an unclassified summary of a document. So I have to assume that if we got an executive summary, there's an underlying document. This was unclassified. Our staff tried for a couple of days to dig that up. We're finally told, no, we can't get that. There's not an unclassified, but apparently there's a classified document, which I think would be very informative for this committee. I would love to know what that document gets into. And I think it's something we should have a follow-up meeting about. But within the bulletized executive summary, it says the intelligence community assesses that U.S. racial and ethnically motivated violent extremists who promote superiority of the white race are the domestic violent extremist actors with the most persistent and concerning transnational connections. And The reasoning it cites is because they have similar ideological beliefs with people outside the United States, and they frequently communicate with and seek to influence one another. To me, I'm not really sure how those two criteria there justify white supremacists being the most violent threat that we face as a country. But I'm sure there's more in that classified document that I would hope we get to. But when we look at events that have happened over the also the document makes further reference to other groups, domestic violent extremists, racially or ethnically motivated violent extremists, animal rights, environmental violent extremists, abortion-related violent extremists, anti-government, anti-authority violent extremists, and then all other domestic terrorism threats. So this DHS document refers to a lot of different threats, with white supremacy only being one of those, and yet that seems to be the only topic, or the only focus of this hearing today. That's a little concerning to me. But moving on to Professor Simi, I really appreciated your work. Obviously, you spent a lot of years studying this topic, and I found that to be very informative. You talked about Timothy McVeigh as well, the Olympic bombings, but then you mentioned that had the perpetrators been people of color or Muslim, you could be sure the response would have been dramatically different. So I actually had our staff do a little research over the last couple of days, pulling domestic attacks just over the last 10 years. And we really do become desensitized to this as a country. I started going, and there were at least 15 here. But I've got to tell you, some are high profile, like the Boston Marathon bombing. Obviously, that was a Muslim extremist. We had the San Bernardino, California shooting that killed 14 Muslim extremists there. The Orlando nightclub shooting just down the road from me in Florida, Central Florida, that killed 49 people. Also not white supremacy. New York City truck attack in 2017 that killed 8. Again, not white supremacy. Now, there are examples of that, and I'm not trying to say that there aren't, but there's a lot of violence in our country, and a lot of people are being killed unnecessarily, and yet we're choosing to zero in on a very small piece of this. I know I'm almost out of time, but Professor Simi, I'd love to hear your comments about what our terrorist extremists look like, because it seems to me, and to cite, not spitting on Dr. King's grave, I have tremendous respect for him. I think he would be ashamed of what's been happening in our country. He would have never condoned $2 billion of violence in a 2-week period last year. But it does make me wonder when you say extremism and terrorism are not about what you look like. Extremism and terrorism are defined by a person's beliefs, feelings, and characters. And just a question for you, sir, would it be fair to summarize that as saying that it's about a person's character and not the color of their skin?
Okay, the gentleman's time has expired, but you can answer that, Dr. Simi.
Thanks for the question. That would be fair in terms of what I'm trying to get at. It's about beliefs, feelings, and behavior, not about what we think in our mind an extremist or terrorist looks like based on our preconceived notions and our biases. And, there is research that shows, for instance, mainstream media outlets do treat acts of violence differently based on race and religion, ethnicity of the perpetrators. So we do have, these biases that are swirling around that affect how we see different types of violence. I'm not suggesting that there aren't various sorts of different acts of violence committed by a whole host of different actors, but we treat different kinds based on race, ethnicity, religion, and other characteristics differently than the kind that we're talking about here today in terms of white supremacist and anti-government militia extremism.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I apologize for going long.
No, not at all. Thank you, Congressman Franklin. I come now to Congresswoman Norton, who's recognized for her 5 minutes of questioning. Gentlelady from the District of Columbia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Franklin went through a series of things that weren't white supremacy. I'd like to look definitionally at what we're talking about, because we certainly are not talking simply about white supremacy, even though many of these attacks have been by white supremacists. So I found that the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, and I think that's a source that all of us would take as objective. They describe militia extremists as domestic violence extremists who, and here I'm quoting them now, who take overt steps to violently resist or facilitate the overthrow of the U.S. government. That's who I'm focusing on. I'd like to ask Mr. McCord, is it fair to say that it has been the goal of the MVEs to overthrow the U.S. government?
I think that has been the goal of, I think, being a check on what they perceive as the tyranny of the state, whether that's state government or federal government, is a common theme among militia and violent extremists. It's not the only theme, but it's definitely a common theme. But I want to be clear that we see that at every level of government. We've seen dramatic plotting and attacks and militia activity in opposition to county level public safety measures, state level COVID related public safety measures, and of course, federal level activity, including the joint session of Congress seeking to certify the election. So what's one of the dangerous things is that these groups make their own decisions about what they think the Constitution means. And if they think that what any elected official is doing doesn't comport with their view of the Constitution and their own civil rights and civil liberties, then they think they are empowered to use arms, to take up arms against that.
Well, let me move on to Attorney General Grewal, again, trying to focus on what it is we're talking about. In October of 2020, federal law enforcement arrested 13 members of what I call the Wolverine Watchmen. Now, that's a private militia group in Michigan. They were arrested for plotting to kidnap and execute Governor Gretchen Whitmer. Attorney General Grewal, did you consider the foiled plot against Governor Whitmer to be a significant escalation of militia activity?
I certainly do, Congresswoman, and it obviously caused us to be on alert as far as protecting other elected officials in my own state, to do better on monitoring suspicious activity reporting in our state. So I certainly saw that to be a significant escalation when a plot can be so brazenly attempted to target a sitting governor of a state.
Well, what federal resources would your office have needed to effectively respond to a similar threat in New Jersey? Yes.
Yeah, I think, again, New Jersey is a bit unique in that I have complete criminal jurisdiction, and I have really strong relationships with our federal partners here. And when Parkland happened, as was alluded to earlier in my testimony, I referenced that for the notion that we didn't want to see what happened there happen here, which was gaps in reporting. So in the wake of the Parkland shootings, we tightened up our reporting system. So anytime that there is a suspicious activity report filed with one of our municipalities, that's shared at our county level, it's shared at our state level, and it's shared with our federal partners, and we follow up on all those leads. That's why we have a better understanding in my state of the number of bias incidents that are happening, where they're happening, and that's why we share that information in real time so policymakers can use it to address concerns in their municipalities or in their districts. And so we could use it to deploy law enforcement resources where we see a problem escalating.
Thank you. Here's another example. This is for Professor Simi. Following the election, and that's what I'm interested in now, the effect on democratic elections. 3%ers armed with semi-automatic rifles surrounded the Arizona state capitol and election offices to protect vote counting. In Georgia, Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger had to be escorted from his office under armed guard as militiamen surrounded the Capitol. Professor Simi, were you surprised by the willingness of militia networks to target free and fair elections, and how does militia activity post-election, including January 6th, relate to the militia movement's opposition to civilian authority in these elections?
Thank you for the question. I wasn't particularly surprised by it, and that was actually one of my most significant concerns leading up to the most recent presidential election, would be that the use of this kind of intimidation and threatening behavior on the part of these types of groups. And so I see this as a substantial kind of central component to their basically motive for existing, which is to exert their will and intimidate democratic forces to bend in their direction and to actually really overcome the democratic process. And so this is one of, I think, the most substantial concerns that we face with these groups, and our tendency to kind of neglect it is really concerning.
Great. The gentlelady's time has expired. Thank you very much. Let's see, is Mr. Donald still with us? Okay, I'm going to go to Congresswoman Tlaib. You are recognized for your 5 minutes.
Oh, here, Mr. Chairman.
All right, Mr. Donalds has appeared. I recognize you for your 5 minutes, Mr. Donalds.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Witnesses, thanks for being here. I do appreciate it. My first question is pretty simple. For any of the witnesses who choose to answer, are you guys aware of what's actually happening in Portland, Oregon right now? Anybody can answer. It's an open question. Come on, guys, don't be shy. Are you guys aware of what's happening in Portland, Oregon right now, or what's happened in Portland, Oregon for the last year? Basically, with respect to consistent, repeated attacks targeting of federal buildings, et cetera, and local municipality buildings in the city of Portland?
I'm certainly aware of some of what has happened in Portland. When you said right now, I did not know if you meant literally right now, and I've been in this, I have not been monitoring the news, so I apologize for not speaking up.
So, all right, so let's expound. I'm good on. Thanks, man. Sorry, I'm in a Dick's Sporting Goods with my son. Explain something to me. Can you guys expound for me what has actually taken place over the last year in the city of Portland, or in the city of Seattle, or in some respects in the city of Minneapolis over the last year?
Congressman, if I can answer, I think that maybe the difficulty in answering this is that the media has not been accurately reporting on what has happened in these cities. So a lot of people a lot of Americans plainly just do not know.
Well, I mean, look, I'm in my comments here. I've been listening to the committee for about an hour. And I think it's important for everybody to recognize that, yes, what happened on January 6th was a tragedy. The Department of Justice is currently going through all of the investigations with everybody that they found that was involved, and they're continuing to look for new people that were involved. I totally support them going through this. They should continue their investigations. People who either through conspiracy or through actual actions enter the Capitol should be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. That is my belief. But at the same time, I'm a freshman member, so obviously I didn't know this was the 6th hearing this committee has had on this subject of domestic terror, white supremacy, however you want to call it. But I think it's important for the Oversight Committee, and this committee in particular, to actually open up the scope of their investigations, because it is clear, if you actually talk to law enforcement people in these various communities, that there is a strain of extremist political violence that is overtaking the country. And, if you want to talk about people on both sides, let's go ahead and say that too, because it does exist. It has been existing. We can't basically denounced since the second it started. But we have to look at it all together. We can't pick and choose which ones we want to focus on and which ones we don't want to focus on. Because while the Department of Justice is actively investigating what happened in the Capitol building on January 6th, like they should be doing, and I'm glad that they're doing that, we do have political extreme organizations that have been consistently attacking law enforcement and federal buildings across the United States. And we should be investigating that too with the full force of Congress, like we're doing the people who did perpetrate frankly, heinous attack and a tragedy on the Capitol on January 6th. With that, I give back.
Thank you, Mr. Donalds. I recognize Ms. Tlaib for your 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Chair Raskin. Thank you so much for all the panelists for being here. I think it's really important to note that this hearing is supposed to be about white supremacist militias, which everyone in this room, virtually, whether you want to admit it or not, knows that it's a deadly problem. The fact that some are trying to shift the focus away from white supremacy to Black Lives Matter movement is an example of upholding white supremacy. So I say enough, and let's focus on this really important, critical issue. I'd like to zero in on one particularly disturbing element of law enforcement coordination with militia movement. It's an organization called Constitutional Sheriffs and Peace Officers Association. Very, very misleading, okay? We're going to call them CSPOA for short. So CSPOA was founded by the former Arizona sheriff, so-called Oath Keeper board member named Richard Mack. The organization coordinates a network of hundreds of what they call, quote, constitutional sheriffs, these are their names, who claim the power to reject state and federal laws they consider to be unconstitutional outside of our courts, okay? On its own website, even claims, quote, the power of the sheriff even supersedes the powers of the president, an absolute absurd statement to say the least. MAC even claims that over 400 sheriffs participated in a coordinated training effort that includes at least 265 private sessions per year, y'all. So, Attorney General, do you know any law enforcement officials in your state who were associated with this organization, and would you be concerned if they were?
I do not, Congresswoman, and I would be if they were. And again, I go back to how New Jersey is different. I have oversight over all law enforcement, including all of our chiefs and our sheriff's offices. And so if something happens where they're not abiding by the rules we set, the policies that we have in place, our state's laws, I have the ability to supersede their authority and take over those departments. And we've exercised that authority in other instances. So I would be incredibly concerned because I think that undermines public trust in law enforcement, which is something we're desperately trying to build, which is the cornerstone of public safety.
Absolutely. And the CSPOA has a clear link to white supremacist Oath Keepers. They rallied alongside the Oath Keepers and other militias in support of Bundy during his 2014 standoff, hosted joint fundraisers, and even in 2019, Stuart Rhodes was even a featured speaker at the CSPOA's convention. Furthermore, leaked documents from the Oath Keepers revealed that the organization CSPOA is a core component of the militia's, this is their program, Sheriff's Outreach Program. Members are instructed to ask local sheriffs if they would be interested in hosting a seminar from Sheriff Mack. The Oath Keepers have advertised CSPOA trainings online as recently as last year or in 2019. Ms. McCord, can you briefly explain the ideological link between CSPOA views of called county supremacy and the militia movement?
Yes, I can. Thank you for that question, because this is something we've seen as a real problem, and one of the reasons we see so much lack of enforcement at the local level of state anti-militia laws. Most states, as Attorney General Grewal has explained, most state attorney generals, unlike him, do not have general criminal enforcement authority. So the enforcement against militia falls on the local law enforcement and local elected district attorneys. So in places where you have constitutional sheriffs, in charge of local law enforcement, who are oftentimes not only supportive of the local militia, but sometimes members of the local militia, sometimes have even advocated for county recognition of local militias. This is obviously a situation where we're not going to have enforcement against those militias. And we've seen that in Virginia. We've seen that in many other states by constituents who have reached out to contact my organization to ask, is this legal? Is this okay? We've seen, consistent with that idea that they report only to the Constitution as they understand it, we've actually seen advocating for county resolutions that would criminally bar county officials from enforcing certain new laws, for example, new gun safety legislation. Yeah. So the constitutional sheriff's movement is a dangerous movement. It has no really authority under law. It's a made up thing, but it has a real impact.
And Ms. McCord, I really want my colleagues to hear this, because it's really, this past year, they actually opposed COVID-19 public health measures and now advertise the 6-week course in ending, quote, tyranny and taking down, these are their words, the deep state. So sheriffs affiliated with CSPOA have spoken in defense of militia-based terrorists who's tried to kidnap Governor Whitmer, my own governor, and even organized civilian posse, y'all, which is a nice name for a lynch mob, in my opinion, to respond to racial justice protests. So I just really want our colleagues to understand this critically important hearing, that we really need to focus on this, because it's dangerous for all of us to live with these groups in our backyard. Thank you so much, and I yield.
Thank you. You can answer. Was that a question, Ms. Tlaib, or no?
No, Chairman. I just wanted everyone to know how dangerous they were. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your statement. All right, now I'm going to recognize myself. I think the ranking member and myself, we have both deferred our questions to the end here. So I want to do some rapid fire questions here. First, starting with you, Ms. McCord. You demonstrated some of the success you've had in using the anti-militia laws, the anti-insurrection laws and anti-paramilitary laws at the state level. Why do we need a federal law, and what could we do with that that's not happening now?
So these state level cases have had, we've had one recently with success and one that's pending, and there is some success historically, but we're really, it's novel litigation because you're using criminal laws to try to bring civil enforcement actions, which state by state is either something that is permissible or is not. And we've seen, as we've been discussing, that there's a lack of enforcement on the criminal side by local law enforcement. I think importantly to your question, though, these are not local problems. As we've seen repeatedly, and it's not just in the last year, but even historically, even if you look back at the armed standoffs at the Malheur Wildlife Refuge in Oregon or in Bunkerville, Nevada, we had militias traveling from across the country to gather in opposition to the federal agents in both of those cases. We had militias from traveling. The conspiracy charges against members of the Oath Keepers who participated in the insurrection involved people from 6 different states. So this is not a local problem. And as the Attorney General has explained, they're trying to synthesize more information, but the federal government has superior access to that information and superior ability to share it all the way through the states and locals. And so coming in to fill that gap, and importantly, to include civil enforcement measures that can really go after the organizations and not just individuals who commit acts of violence, would allow for dismantling it more effectively and systemically.
Okay, that's a really important answer, and I thank you for your clarification at that point. The Attorney General and Professor Seaman, I want to get your reaction to something that's been troubling me. In his opening statement, Mr. Gonzalez wrote, obviously, Black Lives Matter and Antifa are not the only sources of political violence in America, although they do represent the majority of it. And I went to a study that I had come across when I was getting ready for the hearing by the Center for Strategic International Studies, a nonpartisan think tank, which said white supremacists, extremist militia members, and other violent far-right extremists were responsible for 66% of domestic terrorist attacks and plots in 2020, roughly consistent with their share in other recent years. And this is consistent with what we've been told by the FBI director and the
Oh, am I muted? So what I said is, it's all right, my bad. I want it here. Let me pause this real quick, just so we can, there, it's paused. So he just said 66% of the domestic terrorist attacks that were committed in 2000 were committed by white supremacists, according to the study. That is, and I know the answer. You guys ready for this answer? You're sitting, fasten your fucking seatbelts, because the reason why is they're not including any of the attacks that happened last year in Portland, Oregon. They are not including any of the other attacks, the mass shootings that have racial bias against white people, or all these riots and the looting and the $2 billion worth of damage. They are not including any of the Antifa attacks. They are not including the murder of Jay Danielson. They are not including any of those as domestic terror incidents. So just as they don't include half of the mass shootings as mass shootings, because they don't qualify and they don't fit the standard that they set. So when people like this are in control, and these are the people that are in the office right now, there's nothing we can do. This fact is going to be, like, you watch right now, a bunch of all the mainstream news outlets are going to take that clip that he just said, and they are going to run with it, and they're going to go and they're going to look up the study, and they're going to put it out there. But the problem is they are not including any of the real domestic terror attacks that have occurred in the United States. They are, like, even the attack on Gretchen Whitmer. Do you know, or the plotted kidnapping? Do you know that plot is not considered a domestic terror incident? Because what they are doing is, because that could be connected to the left-wing, far-left boogaloo movement that they keep trying to say is right, which it's clearly not. They were anti-Trumpers, anti-police, and anti-government. They are trying to push this agenda, and they're not including anything else. They're not including the fact that the majority, our country was under attack last year every single day for over 100 consecutive days, with people attacking federal federal buildings chanting anti-government rhetoric. How can you not say that they say 66% of attacks? It's because they're not including any of the actual domestic terror incidents. That's why. Just so everyone knew, because I wanted everyone to understand why what he's saying is patently false. It's 100% false because they're not including the data that would show otherwise. They're just simply not doing it. And so if they don't include it, then guess what? It never happened. Scumbags. Anyway, let's go back.
Congress as recently as January and other institutions in the country. Again, there was a claim that 25 Americans have been killed because of, quote, a period of instability instigated by Black Lives Matter. Well, the Washington Post reviewed 27 deaths that were allegedly linked to last summer's protests and found that when a suspect was identified, they were almost never linked to Black Lives Matter. In many cases, the violence was precipitated by far-right extremist provocateurs associated with groups like the Boogaloo Boys or militiamen like Kyle Rittenhouse. So,
False! He's just lying. He's making up stuff. Now he's saying the majority of the attacks of the 27 people that were killed during the riots, he's saying that those were they were brought on by white supremacists? What? This dude is batshit crazy. Raskin is batshit crazy. Okay, I want everyone to understand that. You go tell Tyler Gergen. Remember who he is? He was a BLM photographer that was killed in Louisville, Kentucky, shot by another BLM activist. They tried to say that he had nothing to do with BLM protests, excluding the fact that he was arrested 3 times for rioting and protesting as a BLM activist in the weeks leading up to that, where he shot Tyler Gergen in the head. Let's look at Sequoia Turner, 8-year-old girl shot in the back of, or shot. BLM activists that were guarding a BLM section opened fire on the car with her. She was black. The shooter was black. Actually, all of the shooters were black, but they are only going after one for some reason. They're saying that Raskin is now saying that's not connected to the BLM protest because of what? Because of what? Because the shooter was black and at a protest, therefore it's not connected because it doesn't fit the narrative. How about Frank Underhill? Frank Underhill was a Federal Protective Services agent that was shot. Was he the one? Yeah. Frank Underhill was shot in Oakland, California during a BLM protest by a Boogaloo guy. I mean, they can't, and they keep trying to say Boogaloo. Here's for anyone that doesn't know what the Boogaloo Boys are, or what a lot of them are, because I've talked to some that just disavow any of that. They're libertarians. They don't believe in any of this crap that's going on and all the people that are getting arrested. What far-right group would ever work with an international terrorist organization? If you can tell me that the Boogaloo Boys, 2 of which were arrested for trying to provide material to support to Hamas, the same group that Tlaib and the other bonehead, what's AOC, the same one that they're putting up on a pedestal in recent weeks, you're telling me that a far-right fringe militia group called Boogaloo Boys are trying to work with the same group that the most progressive radical Democrats are backing publicly right now? Get the hell out of here. Damn it.
And one other study I found from the Armed Conflict Location Event Data Project said that 93% of Black Lives Matter demonstrations were peaceful, and that when violence occurred, it was isolated, confined to specific blocks, and again, was subject to that kind of the infiltration of provocateurs. In any event, Attorney General, let me start with you. What do you make of the claim from your experience that Black Lives Matter or Antifa make up the majority of political violence in this country or in your state? And what's wrong with interjecting these kinds of claims when we're trying to seriously study the problem of racist, violent white supremacy in the country?
The problem is that it's distracting, Chairman. And the other problem is that in my experience in New Jersey, it's completely inaccurate. Like other states. In fact, we're the most densely populated state, 9 million residents, one of the most diverse. We have had a year's worth of protests. Just like every other state in the country, we had the Movement for Black Lives take to the streets in New Jersey, but our experience was completely different. We had maybe a handful of arrests, but 99.9% of those protests were peaceful. We had law.
Trenton, New Jersey. Go look up Trenton, New Jersey. A ton of people have been arrested on federal charges for as violations of interstate commerce for burning police cars in Trenton, New Jersey. This guy, this is not true. What they are saying are flat out lies. They protested outside of a prison in northern New Jersey, got violent tear gas and shit had to be used for a week straight over a BLM protest and the treatment of people in an ICE facility in northern New Jersey. Again, unless you pay attention to what is really going on, you will not know, because this douche canoe here is the figurehead of their movement. That's what they are. They are the figureheads of the movement. They are pushing the agenda. They come up here as experts. These clips are going to be played all over mainstream media. They're lying. And everyone can fact check me. Anyone that wants to say that's not true, that people weren't arrested for burning down police cars during the massive riots that occurred in Trenton, New Jersey, come at me, bruh. I mean, you can't even make it up. He said 99.9999% of everything is peaceful. They're lying. They're lying. And I want everyone to realize this, because this is something, regardless of party lines, you can all fact check this yourself. They are straight up lying to you. They're not even hiding it anymore. They are lying.
Enforcement officers marching with protesters because we've worked to build trust between law enforcement and community. We had community partners helping us keep our cities safe. We had thousands of people during the height of these protests protesting not too far from where I am in Newark, and it was peaceful. It was community safety partners helping law enforcement. It was us leveraging the relationships that we had developed throughout the last number of years to make sure that those protests resolved peacefully. And the other thing is, in our experience, we engaged with protesters and we listened to them. We acknowledged the shortcomings that they identified in our law enforcement practices, and we worked with community members to improve them. You can't improve police-community relations without engaging the police and without engaging the community. So we used the whole summer to sit down and have listening sessions in the midst of COVID, many of them virtually. But again, we didn't see that violence in my state. And I think another reason we didn't see that violence in my state is because of those common sense gun safety laws that I talked about. We don't have open carry. It's very difficult to get a carry permit in our state. You can't just show up to our state house, protest or counter protest in an armed way. We didn't see that militia type presence that Professor McCord was talking about at our BLM protests. So again,
I'm sorry to keep interrupting. He lied, and I can prove it. A protest that remained peaceful for more than 4 hours on Monday in Ashbury Park on January 22nd took a combative turn when police began enforcing a curfew around 9:30. Several protesters were arrested. Let's see. Bloomfield. About 75 protesters held a 2-hour silent march and protest in McClare. Some assembled by the park, blah, blah, blah. And it goes on. I know Trenton, New Jersey. And this guy, he actually tweeted out that day too. This is his response. You could tell where he leans. To the thousands of people across New Jersey who are assembled peacefully this weekend, thank you. We hear you, we see you, we respect you, we share your anger, and we share your commitment to change. He is in charge of all police in New Jersey. It's so nutty. They just pretend like it didn't happen. They just pretend. I'm trying to see here. Everyone can look it up. I mean, they did. New Jersey probably had the most diverse group of police chiefs that came out. But again, remember, a lot of the New Jersey police officers were already tied up dealing with all the lockdowns in New Jersey, going after the gym clubs that refused to close, arresting them. That's what New Jersey was mostly focused on, and that's why a lot of these BLM events didn't have negative consequences, or even if they did. God, dude, it's so wrong.
It's distracting. I have a hate problem in my state, 1,400 incidents. The majority of them, 60% anti-Black racist incidents last year. And we have an escalation and a radicalization problem that I'm afraid of with our young people. So that's what I'm trying to stop, and that's what I want to focus on.
Thank you, Attorney General. And Dr. Simi, you can answer my final question too.
Okay, thank you for the question. So we're talking about violent extremism, and we talk about violence. You know, we need to think about what does that mean exactly. Certainly one of the most important indicators of violence would be fatalities. So if you were to look at, for example, the Anti-Defamation League's data on this, this idea that Black Lives Matter and or Antifa are committing more violence is certainly not consistent with what we know about fatalities. At least is the data that's collected by the Anti-Defamation League and one of the most significant trainers of law enforcement across the country on these issues. So that it just doesn't seem to be borne out in that respect. Another issue here to consider is that we are dealing with a perceptual bias problem, and so when the Attorney General mentioned the distraction, sometimes it's intentional, sometimes it's unintentional. But in any case, when the effort to discuss militias and white supremacist extremism is consistently met with "what about so and so," it is a distraction, but it also reflects this, I think, very deeply entrenched perceptual bias. And we need to root that out in addition to dealing with the type of extremism we've been talking about today.
Well, thank you very much. I'm going to introduce into the record an article that just came out of great relevance to our hearing today, which says Nevada County GOP cancels meeting amid fear of Proud Boy insurgency. And there were threats of the Proud Boys to this Republican meeting. And obviously both parties were targeted on January 6th at the RNC and the DNC with explosive devices. So I don't see any reason why we should think of this as some kind of, partisan tit for tat where we've got to, point at other sides. I don't identify anybody here with the violent militias and the movements of violent white supremacy that we're talking about. Congressman Sessions, I don't know if you had any final words you wanted to add today.
Chairman, thank you very much. I'd just like to thank our witnesses who have taken time to not only properly prepare, but also to prescribe their viewpoints on sheets of paper that would allow us an opportunity to really drill down on some of the facts of the case. I think all four of our witnesses presented information that was pertinent to the needs of this committee, and I think overwhelmingly, perhaps the viewpoint that we've got to work together if we're going to stop this. It does make a difference, and working together means that we not just find common ground, but that we find that violence is what we're against. We're against extremism, and we would be against the use of force. We've brought in other ideas today, as others have, about perhaps religion in this also, religion that might take place against people of Jewish content and faith. Perhaps we have other ideas about things that are violent, and I just think that we should stand together and say we're against use of force, we're against violence, we're against any group of people, whether they're official or non-official, using their ideas and ideals to overcome this country. I find it very interesting that and it's a longer debate. It's just a longer debate. But that there would be people who might be considered dangerous to this country because they were, quote, anti-government, but others can show up and be anti-capitalism and not be considered a threat to this country. And it's staggering to me because, as I've told you, during my dad's time as FBI director, there were large numbers of people that were really anti-IRS. They did not like the tax code that we had. They were violent. They killed a federal judge during a period of time or several years ago. And whether it's anti-IRS, whether it's anti-federal judges or federal government, whether it is some things that ride the view of economics, I think that we need to understand that the basis of what this makes this country work is rule of law and avoiding extremism. So, Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you again for trying to work to the middle of ideas. But I think we've got to acknowledge that whether you're anti-capitalism or whether you're anti-Jewish, to use violence is something that we should all be against. Use of force and violence as an outcome is a danger to not just keeping our country safe, but individuals who find themselves somewhere in the middle of that. So I want to thank you and our witnesses. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Mr. Sessions, for your thoughtful and perceptive remarks there. And I guess I would just close by underscoring the public service that all of our witnesses have done today.
Shut up. I'm done. I'm not. You guys want to listen to that? Go to CNN. He's an idiot and a liar, and I'm not going to listen to him or broadcast his voice at all on my network because I think he's a lying, scum-sucking loser. Anyway, I saw a couple of comments, so let me clear something up. The Attorney General from New Jersey, all you idiots out there that were commenting that he's Muslim because you can't understand the difference of religions. He's not Muslim. He's Sikh. Not Muslim. In fact, they've been persecuted by Muslims in the past. Use your head. Don't write stupid stuff. You literally are like you're literally like, what's the right word? I don't know any other way to say it. Use your head. Use your head. You're making us look bad, okay, when you say stupid stuff. And everyone keeps saying it and making derogatory comments towards Muslims. He's not Muslim. So stop saying he is. Seriously. Educate yourselves. That's why we do this. That's why we're doing everything we're doing. Educate yourselves. That's why we try to show this. The best thing and the best case in point and I should make it into an ad for Citizen Stringer. The best thing that was said in this entire hearing is people said, why aren't people outraged about the BLM protests and the terrorist attacks on the Capitol in Portland, in Minneapolis, in New York even? How come nobody? And the expert said, because the media doesn't show it. Because the media doesn't show it. That's why we're doing it. Trump is my press said this is what will appear on Citizen Stringer. Bullshit lies. Well, you obviously, I don't know why you're here. Trump is my press on Twitch, because that's not what the idea of Citizen Stringer is. The idea of Citizen Stringer is to allow people with actual facts and actual intellect, far out, or not just intellect, but interests in reporting truthfulness, would have the ability to do so, and that's why we've created it. If you don't like it, Trump is my prez or whatever your name is, just go bug off, dude. Go somewhere else. You don't need to be here. I'm not paying you to be here. You're not paying me to sit and watch this. Go move on somewhere else. If you don't like what the content is, that's the beauty of not running the platform. You don't have to sit there and complain about it. It's so silly. It's so silly. This was the best example of falsehoods in our political system, because they lied over and over and over. And that's literally what they did. They lied today in these hearings all the time. And they even had the gall to say, well, don't talk about BLM extremism because that's not why we're here. Don't talk about the anti-American extremism because that's not why we're here. We're here to talk about white supremacy because that is what they are continuously trying to push. That is that is the agenda. And everyone said, when do we stop? When do we stand up? We are doing it. That's what we are doing now when we provide context. If I can sit and describe something and this video has 1,000 views, that means 1,000 people listen to the truth. You listen to the lies and then you listen to the truth. Eventually, we will have a bigger platform. That's what we're working towards. It takes time. But someone said that's what I mean. Who is checking the stories when placed on Stringer? Everything has to be manually approved. Because, again, we have to monitor our platform and make sure Apple and iTunes and all that stuff doesn't pull down our apps. Everything's going to be approved. Any article has to be edited and checked for facts. Every video has to be vetted and checked for facts. We're not going to allow just random stuff on there. And that's the beauty of having the system, is that we're crowdsourcing the news. We're not going to allow fake news there. And if it's unverifiable, it will not get published. It's not like... like if you make a live video on Facebook, you could say whatever you want and then the video goes live. That's not what it's like with the Citizen app or the Citizen Stringer app. When it comes out, you're submitting a video and then once it gets approved to be posted out. And again, it's not about party lines or about anything else for that matter. But if you're reporting on a news story, it has to be a real one. We will verify that it's a real one before we publish it out. you know? And that's the thing. So sorry for jumping all over you. The way you said it, you didn't ask a question. You just said it was going to report lies. It's going to report the same lies as what you said. So, which is, false. But I appreciate everyone for watching. I got to go pick up my truck. It's done. I will not be making a video tonight. I will make one tomorrow at 10 a.m. and then probably starting next week. If I do, my schedule's changing. I'll talk about that after, not next week, but the week after. Because after 10, I'm gone for the week. I'll make videos when I'm live and all that stuff. But if you guys want to support Citizen Stringer, the link is in your chat. I really would appreciate it. We just reached 60 backers and $5,000 of the total goal in 3 days. So we're doing pretty good. I appreciate all you guys for watching. We'll see you later. Bye.